So, financial grade security, which we think is for banks, but it's not only for banks, right? I mean, there's plenty of high security APIs that needs to be protected that can benefit from things we do in financial grade APIs as well. I'm Jonas Iggbom. I work at a company called Curity that develops an authorization server, OAuth OpenID Connect server. And we've implemented a lot of these things that we're going to talk about here. If we start with financial grade APIs, we typically associate these with like banking APIs, transaction APIs, et cetera. But there's obviously a lot more APIs that require high security, like medical, healthcare APIs, other high sensitive APIs that we can benefit from implementing some of these things. And not only that, some of these patterns and technologies that we're going to look at are actually fairly easy to implement, at least from our perspective. It probably depends on what solutions you use, but there's specifically for financial grade APIs, there's a lot of regulations and directives that are driving this. Most are probably familiar with the first two, at least. I have some experience on open banking Brazil. We've helped some banks cover that recently. So, what can we do to implement financial grade API security? These are some of the things we're going to look at today. I'm not specifically going to cover mutual TLS necessarily, but I need to cover it in order to talk about sender constrained access token because they're somewhat related, right? We're going to have a lot of abbreviations here, so we're going to look at PAR, Pushed Authorization Request, JARM, JOT Secured Authorization Response Mode, CIBA, that was, I think, just talked about a little bit in the previous talk as well, and then at the end, two kind of patterns for tokens, something that at least we at Curity call the phantom token and the split token pattern. So, mutual TLS, a normal TLS session is essentially one way, right? The client can authenticate the server and we have sort of a trust that I'm talking to the correct server. But the server has no idea and can't really authenticate the client in that sense. This is pretty traditional. This is sort of, you go to an HTTPS website, this is pretty much what happens, right? Mutual TLS will do this both ways, meaning we can have the server also authenticate the client. So there's mutual TLS back and forth. So when we leverage mutual TLS between a client, an application, that, and in this case, obviously, is sort of the end goal is for the client to obtain some kind of token. We can bound the token that gets issued to the certificate of the client, meaning we end up with what's called a sender constrained token, or it's also referred to as proof of possession tokens. So what we normally deal with if we don't use that token is bearer tokens, essentially. But a proof of possession token or sender constrained token, like I said, it's bound to the client. So what happens here is we essentially protect that this token can't be stolen and used by a different client. So in a bearer token scenario, the client has a token, sends it to the API or API gateway. The API gateway performs some checks to validate the token, right? It's going to be pretty rudimentary things like can maybe check the issuer audience, expiration, and things like that. And that's all fine. Client 2 could potentially steal that token, perform the exact same thing, but the API gateway have no way of controlling or checking that this token belonged to client 1, right? So here, everything is going to be fine. The API gateway will check the expiration and whatever checks it does, and will happily accept the token. In a sender-constrained token scenario, the token that the first client has is bound to that client, and the API gateway will check it, it's okay, because it can, we'll look into details how it does that later. But if client 2 steals this obviously the API gateway will deny it, even though the token could be perfectly valid. It could have been not expired, it has the scopes needed and things like that. But it performs a check of a specific claim that can be used in the token, a CNF claim that contains the certificate thumbprint of the client that the token got issued for, which in this case would have been client 1 then. So the flow of this is, we have a client, it establishes a mutual TLS session with the authorization server. The authorization server, when it issues the token, will then use the certificate information from the MTLS session, and it will add that as a CNF claim in the token, meaning now we've bound that token to that client because it's that client's certificate. When the client then uses this sender-constrained token, sends it to the API gateway, we also establish a mutual TLS session with the same certificate from the client. Now the API gateway can check what certificate is used for the mutual TLS session, and it can compare that to the certificate thumbprint that is in the token. So now we know that, okay, I have a mutual TLS session with the client, and I have a token that is bound to that specific client. So that's all. This is all easy in sort of this graph and how you explain it. The complexity here obviously comes into sort of a PKI, right? I mean, you have mutual TLS that needs to be set up. Not saying that that's super hard, but it's sort of more complex than just looking at this graph. There's more complexity to that, but mutual TLS in itself is a good mechanism. Pushed authorization requests. So this is a way to protect the integrity of the request itself, the request to the authorization server. So in a normal authorization request, do I have a pointer? No. In a normal authorization request, we send a bunch of parameters on the URL, and one problem with this here is we can't sort of assure that the client is legitimate. We can't necessarily ensure that the parameters are okay. They could have been tampered with on the way. Furthermore, the parameters can also end up in logs. I mean, depends on how the logging is configured, but there could be information in there that we don't want to have in the logs. And there's no way here to guarantee that these parameters have not been tampered with on the way to the authorization server. So a pushed authorization request sends instead a signed JOT with the parameters to the authorization server. It initiates an authorization request to the server. The authorization server sends a request ID back. So in this case, we can send the parameters in a post, in the body of a post, making them more protected, right? And it's also authenticated session to begin with. The initial session is authenticated compared to a traditional approach where the first initial GET request is not authenticated. The authorization server responds with a request ID, and then the client can perform a GET passing that request ID because the server holds that request. This sort of protects the request parameters, given that we can perform this in a post command, and we're also have an authenticated session to begin with. One aspect of this is because the client is authenticated before the authorization request happens, we can kind of typically ease on sort of redirect URI policies or restrictions. Otherwise, they need to be pretty strict so that we know we redirect to the correct place. Here it's authenticated, so we can loosen those a little bit. JARM, JOT Secured Authorization Response Mode, is a way to protect the other way. It's actually to protect the response that's coming from the authorization server. So if PAR is to kind of protect the request, this is to protect the response. It can protect against attacks on the authorization code response that comes back that we then use to obtain a token. So in a standard response, we get the code, potentially a state, but there are no ways here to ensure that was this issued by the correct authorization server, for example. The authorization server could have been compromised, or you're actually talking to an attacker's authorization server that handles the token exchange and everything on the back end. Also, does this code belong to the same state that could have been tampered with, for example? In a secured response, we get assigned JOT as the response instead. So here we know that you can't tamper with that on the way in the return, and the client, instead of just receiving the code in the response, gets assigned JOT that it can decode and verify the signature, obviously, and then the code is available in that decoded result. So the code response gets integrity protected, mitigates replay attacks, and can protect from mix-up attacks, which is where we can, where there could be an attacker's authorization server that the client is actually talking to without knowing it. CIBA, client-initiated back-channel authentication. So this was mentioned in the previous talk, although I kind of missed the part there. This is introducing a decoupled authentication flow. So the relaying party initiates the authentication instead of the user initiating the authentication. And so very useful for customer service type of scenarios where normally you would get asked a bunch of questions to sort of verify that you are who you are, phone number, address, whatever it might be. But in this case, the customer service agent can actually initiate the authentication for the user and sort of trigger a prompt on the app or device or something like that. So traditional front channel authentication, we have an app that starts an authorization. The authorization request goes through the bottom left there is the browser, essentially. The authorization request gets to the authorization server. There's a code sent back. There's authentication happening. I think that code was in the wrong order. There's an authorization request. There's authentication. The authorization code gets back to the application. That's where we are now, right? And then the application can redeem the code for a token. This is a traditional flow, and it's initiated by the user using the application. But in a CIBA flow, the authorization server, the client or the consumption device, as it's called in the flow, initiates the authentication request. The authorization server then sort of pushes the authentication to the authentication device. So it's decoupled. It's not the user using the authentication device that's initiating the authentication at all, right? It's the authorization server. So when authentication happens there, the authorization server can issue a token to the actual client. So in this case, this is the right side is the banking user customer, and the left side is the customer service agent, for example. Phantom token and split token. So these are not these are not standards or specifications. They're more patterns that can be used to reduce the exposure of information to the client, especially PII information. They're very much patterns to make sure that we don't actually end up with a jot in a public client, essentially. Most of the time, the information that's in the jot and the attributes there are intended for the API, not for the client. So we don't really need it to be issued for the client, right? We need the API to consume that information. The other part is, if you issue a jot to the client, you will probably see that developers will see that, oh, there's a bunch of information here. I am going to use this information. And then if the jot format changes or something like that, you break the application, which is also not good. So with the phantom token flow, we instead issue an opaque token to the client. An opaque token, it's by reference token, it's essentially just a string, right? So the client doesn't know anything what this is. The only way to know what that token really means is to introspect it. And that's essentially what happens here. So the API gateway receives the API. It doesn't have to be an API gateway. It could be a reverse proxy, or it could probably happen within. The API gateway gets the opaque token. It sort of introspects the opaque token, and in return, in the response, gets a jot. In the Curity world, this is really easy. You can get a jot in the response instead of the data. The API gateway can then pass the jot on to the APIs instead of the opaque token. We haven't issued an opaque token to the client, or we haven't issued a jot to the client either. So inside, we have a jot. Outside, we have an opaque token. The split token flow is similar, but not, and also quite more complex, I would say. It's more complex to set up, at least. It achieves the same thing in the end. Here, we do the token service. So the token service actually does issue a jot, but it's not sent to the client. The token service instead breaks up the jot and it sends the signature to the client. So think of the signature that gets sent to the client as the opaque token in this case, right? We just send the signature of the jot to the client. The client would sort of use, that looks like a wrong order. The other thing that the token service does is it sends the header and the body and the hashed representation of the signature to the API gateway. It's probably not directly to the API gateway, but it's sort of easier to picture that here. It's probably to a cache that the API gateway has access to and can look up things in. So that takes a little bit more work on the token service, obviously. It needs to have the capability of pushing this head and body and the hash signature to a cache. Oh, the cache is up there. I didn't even see that. So what happens there is the header and the body gets stored in the cache, and the hash signature becomes the key to access that information in the cache. So then when it comes time to call the API, the client will send the signature to the gateway. The gateway will then hash that and then use the hashed signature to look up the header and the body, basically the remaining pieces of the jot in the cache, right? And then reassemble that. So we're taking the split token and we're putting it back together, and then we can pass that on to the API. So it achieves the same thing. There's a different flow of how things happen. Obviously, we get away from the API gateway performing introspection on tokens. But on the other hand, in this case, it could probably be a latency or delay issue. If the token service doesn't quickly enough push the information into the cache and doesn't have that information in the cache when the incoming request from the client comes, you're gonna get a cache miss, right? There's nothing in the cache for it. So I'd say it very much depends on the use case and the scenario and the environment, which pattern to use. Phantom token is probably what at least we at Curity see more of over split token, but there are cases for the split token too, for sure. So in summary, FAPI or financial grade APIs are for higher security environments, not just banks. There's a couple of things that we've looked at here that can heighten, strengthen the security of this a lot. We can safeguard against the use of stolen or lost tokens using sender constrained tokens with mutual TLS. Obviously, the request and the response can be protected using PAR and JARM that are pretty easy to implement, right? So if sender constrained tokens probably takes a little bit more to implement, but PAR and JARM are very easy to implement. Decoupled user authentication will help in at least specific scenarios, not necessarily useful for all types of authentication scenarios, but there are, if the use cases are there, that's also fairly easy to implement. And then finally, leverage some kind of pattern coupled with the API gateway or reverse proxy or similar to prevent unintended data to be leaking out to public clients. That was that. Happy to take questions.
Question for back channel. You said the client pushes the authentication request to the user agent. So are we assuming there's a live connection? Because normally the connection is initiated by the user agent. How will you push it if my phone is
there's a couple of different methods in how it pushes it, I think. There's a couple of different methods in how it pushes it, but there's the user device that gets prompted for the authentication has to have the authenticator that is used for the flow. I mean, the authenticator there could be probably several different types of authenticator, but if you would think it's email or SMS, it's not a live connection, right? You can still push an SMS and say, hey, click this link to authenticate or whatever it might, or email, but there could probably be other types of authentication mechanisms there too, yeah.
Is the PAR request done through back channel? That's not clear here, or are you seeing that the PAR request is through front channel?
The PAR request. That's pretty far back. Yeah. Okay. This one, right?
The post authorized PAR. That is through back channel, right?
Yes. Yes, it's a specific endpoint on the authorized.
Why not just make the authorized endpoint authenticated? If your concern is just adding authentication.
But that's what this is doing, right? A traditional authorization request initiates with a GET request. That's not authenticated.
This is the request going from the client directly to the authorization server through a secure channel, right? Oh. This is the back channel, right?
So you want to hide the scopes,
right,
from the user agent.
Exactly. So the user agent sees only the code.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You want to prevent the user agent from being able to even see what's being posted or sent to the server. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's other ways of doing this too. You can send an encrypted JOT with these things. So that would, I mean, it would be a similar approach. You are then protecting what you're sending to the server, but
the data will be
Yeah, and you also all of a sudden have to deal with sort of encryption keys on the client, which you don't really have to do in the same way here. So
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
No one else, yeah. So I forgot the name of the flow, but you said the client has to verify what came from authorization server. I forgot which flow was that.
client has
JARM, I think.
JARM.
Yeah. So in that case, the client will need a public key from authorization server, right? So is there a recommended way to share the key between the two?
No.
Normally, a client doesn't care about the signature, but in this case, you need a public key of auth server to validate. Sorry?
Yeah, you don't have to have, the client needs, I mean, in some ways it needs to get the key, but you can use the JOX endpoint of the authorization
well-known
server.
URL,
So
whatever standard
it
is.
doesn't have, it needs it to do that, but it doesn't have to hold it permanently, so to speak, right?
Yeah, maybe caching, but not forever.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, that's all we have time for today.
right.
Thank you all for coming. Jonas, great job. And as always, please go into the Identiverse app and fill out your session surveys for this one and any others that you attended this week. It helps the content committee make sure we're giving you the right stuff that you want to hear for next year. Thank you all for attending. Have a great and safe trip home. See you next year.